is this is where this new left murdered the old left and completely unmoored it from what it used to do, and it's kind of historical grounding. And it's I think a fascinating story that needs to be told. But I think that this is crucial to understanding why we see this kind of woke monstrosity that's so paternalistic and so saccharine, but also just so corporate, just so like everything they write. Have you noticed if you read their theory and then you read their academic work, right? And then you read it like an activist statement, and then you read a mission statement from a multinational corporation. It's like reading it's identical script.
Like you preach like brothers of all races unite for, and then you get fucking shot in your bed, by the American government, right? Like Fred Hampton, and you like preach all this shit about white supremacy. You get scholarships, and like corporations agree with you, and you're like, oh, it's so weird. James Lindsay, Wikipedia describes you as a cultural critic, mathematician, and conspiracy theorist. What do you think of that characterization?
I think it's pretty funny. It's pretty awesome, actually. I got introduced to actually, I was at a conference. I'm trying to think back to the story. I was at a conference a few weeks ago, a month ago or something like this. And I met a guy, he's a physician. He is familiar with me, but he's not terribly familiar with me. So we're sitting talking across a table, and he types my name into Google, and up comes my Wikipedia, and he reads the little blurb that it gives. And there it is, me. And he says, wow, there are 4 pieces of slander in your little tiny Wikipedia blurb on Google, which means you must be an absolute rock star. So that's how I feel about this.
Well, I it worries me because sometimes I meet people in person that I really like, and I'm like, oh, this person's really great. And then I think, don't Google me because you're going to hate me. But I think we come from actually, I don't think we come from completely different backgrounds, but I think there are things that we would probably agree on and disagree on, but we have a shared, I think, enemy, and that is wokeness and the ideology of social justice. Now, I come at this from a left-wing position, but from what I understand, you also initially came at it from a left-wing position. Do I have that right? And can you give me a sense of how you came to be such a critic of social justice movements, so-called social justice movements?
Yeah, I think all of that's correct. So what you described is saying that we have some things we disagree on and some things we agree on, and that we have a common enemy called wokeness. I think just means that we're people, to put it kind of simple and mildly. But I was a denizen of the left. I don't consider myself a right-wing person now, but the internet has concluded that I am. I consider myself to be as independent as I can possibly be. A lot of people understand, because I criticize this social justice, wokeness, whatever we want to call it, movement, that I am certainly not a leftist. But I am lately in a lot of trouble with the right, with the reactionary right in particular, who are using very manipulative and vicious tactics against me as well. Because it turns out that I stand for things like individual liberty. I stand for, the freedom for us to pursue our lives unhindered, especially by governments or even large corporate manipulation. I'm pretty much just against abuse and manipulation. And that lands me in this kind of a weird place. I may skew slightly politically conservative given the times right now, but economically it's kind of up in the air. And socially, I'm certainly not a social conservative. Social conservatives annoy me. And so they, in fact, annoy me a lot. So I'm kind of like in this weird position. But seeing that I came originally out of academia, and I started to kind of traffic in online discussions in a position on the left, and I spent a lot of time active in what was called at the time the New Atheism movement, which skewed pretty strongly left. My original criticisms really came down from a left-wing position in Cynical Theories, which is my most famous book that I wrote with a woman, Helen Pluckrose, who is, by the way, in London and a leftist. which we wrote from a left liberal position. In Cynical Theories, we actually argued that we're against the so-called social justice movement, which we put with a capital S and a capital J, because we are for the idea of social justice, which would, in general, social progress. I'm a little warier around the terms progress and justice now because they're so deeply kind of co-opted. But what brought me to be a critic of that movement in general is two things. One was having been directly exposed to it, and the other was taking the time to read it. And by reading their own ideas in their own words and comparing that with what I was seeing put into practice from actual people who espouse those views, I decided that it was a disaster in the making, that I got in a lot of trouble. In 2018, I read quite a bit, and we were doing this thing, and I got some feedback from peer review journal articles at Hypatia, which is the Journal of Feminist Philosophy, very famous, obviously very left-wing. And I read the peer review commentary that we got back on a paper we had submitted there, and they were very warm to the paper, but they convinced me that the logic of woke contains, this is how I phrased it, and I got in a lot of trouble for this because I got accused of being insane. It contains, this is a very modest statement, actually. It contains the seed of a genocide. Its logic allowed to flourish and bloom, watered, nourished, and allowed to grow to fruit, which are a lot of things that may or may not ever happen, in my estimation, ends in genocide because of its distaste for compassion. It's very kind of friend-enemy, you're with us or you're absolutely against us, and an impediment. It's tribal, almost folkish identity politics, which gets feudal. And in fact, I said tribal, it gets extraordinarily tribal in the kind of social identity sense, and it stokes those fires of division and conflict. It ends nowhere good. And so at that point in 2018, I went from being kind of a casual student and critic to I literally quit my job and became a full-time student and critic of this movement, given those concerns.
Yeah, I shared this horror, actually. I was on a listserv. I am on a listserv for Indigenous psychology, because I'm Indigenous myself, and I write critically of social policy in Canada aimed at Indigenous people, which I've talked about a lot on this podcast. Probably don't need to belabor the point anymore. But it annoys me because through this language of caring and so on, it's really belittling and ironically really racist. In attempting so hard to be anti-racist, they wind up repeating all these old racist tropes. And if you see through all the kindness, you see the old ideas coming up again. So this really annoys me. So I'm on this listserv, and it got, over time, over the years, it's got more and more disturbing, where they are talking about white people this, white people that. And I just thought, I could take this. I could just, copy and paste this email thread and hit, find and replace on Word and put Jews. And this would be a horrific conversation. But because it's aimed at so-called white people, whatever that means, it's just fine. So is scapegoating a racial group wrong just when the Nazis did it, or is it just wrong generally? I'm pretty convinced that it's just a bad way of understanding social problems, that if you scapegoat a particular group, it doesn't lead you to good places. And I don't mean, I agree with you, it doesn't mean literally we're going to see a genocide or something that's crazy. But if you're taking a step down that path, you should probably turn around. You've gone the wrong direction.
Yeah, I agree. And
I wondered also about, I think, obviously the famous grievance studies hoax, which is how I first obviously learned about you, and probably a lot of people did too. There's a few things I want to ask you about that. One is, how the hell did you write so many papers so fast? And the other thing is, there was one of the papers in a feminist journal had rewritten, apparently, the media says, now correct me if I'm wrong, had rewritten parts of Mein Kampf. And I found that to be very interesting because it reminded me of exactly what I said. You could go into this listserv and Control F white people and put Jews. And I wonder, was that your line of thinking there? Or is it true that was a rewrite of Mein Kampf?
Okay, so yes, that is all true, and the grievance studies affair is why I was submitting an academic paper to Hypatia in the first place. I don't spend a lot of my time writing feminist theory. The question about how did we write so many papers so quickly is that it turns out to be really easy to write them, partly because we were making it up, and partly because it's very formulaic. You just kind of have to figure out some interesting and kind of unique angle on saying exactly the same thing and kind of exactly the same pattern, and then you just sort of massage it until it works. And so in a sense, we did write very distinct papers. I mean, 20 of them as a matter of fact, but they're not different really at their hearts, not very different. They're extraordinarily formulaic. You start out with an introduction and you say, here's some kind of a problem that heretofore the hegemonic narratives have prevented us from being able to see. You phrase that however you want. Then you say, here's what the literature already says about that. Here's how it's been problematized. And here's a problematic that people haven't identified. And here's a completely crazy solution that usually involves grabbing more power, or just some kind of, the kind of typical, it sounds like pablum, but it's not, where we're going to stick more power, or we're going to stick more diversity, more inclusion. We must demand more of this, demand more of that in the university and policing and schools, whatever it happens to be. And it's actually quite formulaic. So it turns out to be the hardest part is thinking up the kind of creative, goofy angle, because especially when we were trying to make them funny, all the rest is literally just kind of like putting Lego blocks together. It's just extraordinarily simple. And so I write quickly as it is, so we could draft these things and then edit them and send them off very quickly. One of them, in fact, the hardest ones that we did, and I say plural, that we did were rewrites from Mein Kampf. And one of those was accepted by a feminist social work journal, and one of them was not. The one that was not was exactly what you just described. We took selected passages where Adolf Hitler is particularly salty about Jewish people in Mein Kampf, not any like continuous passage, just a paragraph from chapter 2, a paragraph from chapter 3, a section from chapter 8, or whatever. I'm just picking numbers out of the air, by the way. So this is just, to give you a sense of how we did. And then we did Control F, Jews, white people, and then just started making it all work. And it turned out that one was very difficult because it was very narrative driven and kind of I don't know if you've read Mein Kampf, but I had the pleasure a few times now, and it's a rambling narrative account. It's a gigantic autoethnography in the modern parlance. His frustrations with Vienna and Austria, and then eventually Marxists, and then later Jewish. He decides all the Marxists are Jewish, and now he's got the formula, and then he's creating this. So the one that did get accepted was not that. What we actually did was the 12th chapter of Mein Kampf. He's laid out all the problems. Chapter 11 is very famously the weird race occultism chapter, where he blames everything on the Jews. If you actually do kind of a search or whatever, and it's like the different chapters, how many times does Hitler mention the Jews in Mein Kampf? It's like, 8, 18, 24, through the different 6, through the different chapters. Then you get to chapter 11 and it's like 380. It's just all he talks about. And then chapter 12, it's like 10 or 12 times. It's like it really comes. There's that one chapter that's really, this is the culmination of what's really wrong in the world. And it's this weird Helena Blavatsky theosophical race occultism turned into anti-Semitism and other forms of racial hate. And then chapter 12 is, we need a movement. What do we do about this problem? And so we took chapter 12 and because it's organizing a movement, and we rewrote it and said that this is in terms of, we took everywhere he says our movement and replaced it with intersectional feminism. And then we turned it into an offensive against something. This was Helen Pluckrose's idea, an offensive against what feminists refer to as choice feminism, or sometimes there's a spin-off from that that's neoliberal feminism. And so choice feminism is the idea that women being free and independent to make their own choices and live their lives according to those choices is an expression of feminism, as opposed to some kind of, class solidarity. And so choice feminism is a huge target in that literature. So we set that up as the enemy and saying we needed intersectional solidarity as the solution, and just copied Hitler. And neoliberal feminism is the kind of marketing of that. So you have the idea of the, beautiful model driving a race car or whatever, and so this is it, and this is feminist empowerment, but they're selling products using it. So it's the idea of using the image of the free independent woman to sell products is this neoliberal feminism. And we took those two things and said that they are the exact trap that maintains hegemonic structures. And as opposed to those, we need an intersectional solidarity. And we titled the paper, Our Struggle is My Struggle. And of course, Mein Kampf in German means my struggle. And it was accepted by a feminist social work journal called Ophelia, that seemed to like, Hitler had, I think 13, maybe it's 14. I'd have to look back. It's not like I traffic in the book all the time, points for how to organize his movement. And we took a few of those out because it was just too long. And then we condensed a few of them and, took 2 or 3 of them and smashed them into one, but made an 8-point plan for transforming feminism away from neoliberal and choice feminism, Western feminism, and turning it into something that would be very solidarity and overthrow society based through intersectionality. And we didn't think it was going to succeed, but it turns out that it did succeed. So that was actually true. And like I said, that one actually, out of the 20, probably took us the most work. It was very hard to take his angry, rambling screed and turn it into something that resembles an academic paper. We also pointed out more technically that Hitler, writing in, this would be in, I guess, the late 1920s for Mein Kampf, was very deeply entrenched in the modernist tradition in Europe. And obviously, a lot of the woke stuff is very postmodernist. So they have this kind of fundamental worldview disagreement that we had to massage our way through so that it would be acceptable to a more postmodern journal editor audience, while maintaining the kind of, fist pounding modernism of Hitler's Nazi machine. So that was a challenge, but this is true. It has been changed enough to where it's reasonable that it would fool somebody. The ethos, a lot of the phrasing, entire large sections are extraordinarily reminiscent of the original, but it had to be changed quite a lot to make room for theory, to change the content, and to actually avoid automatic plagiarism detectors. If the wording was identical, it would just find that, and we'd get disqualified immediately.
And people have said, of course, that it didn't really follow Mein Kampf, that perhaps it took some paragraphs and so on. I made a video a while back called Marx, Fascist, or CEO. And it was like a little game show. Round 1, who lauded that we are finally placing authenticity over consumerism? If you said Marx, you would be an idiot. Marx doesn't say that kind of thing. Go read a book. No, this is a CEO, obviously. Round 2. Who was it that said, modern civilization has pushed man onward? It has generated in him the need for an increasingly greater number of things. It has made him more and more insufficient in himself and powerless. If you said Marx, get the out, just go. It's obviously a fascist. You suck at this game. It's Julius Evola. Get out of here. Just to show the degree of distance that the contemporary left has traveled from anything like Marx's ideas. So Marx is talking about freedom of the press and how he feels the need for freedom in his soul and all this kind of stuff. And then you've got contemporary CEOs talking about how you don't need money to be happy. and fascists talking about the masses being stupid and led by demagogues, fascists saying this. And the democracy being an illusion. And do you know how many people were fooled by that? How many people thought that the CEOs,
like everybody.
Yeah, and we're quite surprised to learn that Marx would not have been in agreement, surprise, surprise, with fascists who were like quite vehemently anti-Marxist and like sort of a bit like, obviously like Hitler having this kind of like Tourette syndrome for Jews and Marxists and then mangling all of this together into some conspiracy. Although you have been criticized for doing just that. That's what people say about you, that your sort of hate, or not hatred, but your distaste for what you call cultural Marxism. Although on your website you explain that it would be more like cultural Marxianism. but it doesn't have a ring to it. But people have said that this is actually you're being anti-Semitic, and that you're propagating anti-Semitic conspiracies. What do you respond to things like that?
I mean, that's, I think, fairly ridiculous. What animated the characters in history who have been identified as cultural Marxists. So we're talking about George Lukács. I don't actually know what Lukács's religious affiliation was. He's a Hungarian, so I can't comment on that. Antonio Gramsci. I do not think Gramsci was Jewish, but he may have been. But then the members of the Frankfurt School, Max Horkheimer, Walter Benjamin, Herbert Marcuse, Theodor Adorno, they were Jewish. But what motivated these characters was Marxism, not being Jewish. And as a matter of fact, you can read quite a large number of Jewish people having commented on these same people and saying that what they're reading is not reflective of Judaism whatsoever. And I hear frequently from conservative Jews and rabbis in particular, with a lot of gratitude for the work that I'm doing. And so I feel like this is a straw man that has been erected to protect, whether we want to call this cultural Marxism or Western Marxism or sometimes critical Marxism, from scrutiny by hiding it behind this label. I certainly have literally no animosity toward Jews. I get in arguments. So another group of people on the internet who, and some in real life, who literally hate me are the actual anti-Semites, because they're very upset with me that I will not, as they phrase it, take the J pill. I will not blame everything on the Jews. I do not actually think Jews or Jewish faith is the problem. I think that there's a underlying current of kind of angry and perverse mysticism that can latch onto anything. And some people are Jewish in their expression of their mysticism. Some people are Christian. There are Christian mystics, like Hegel, for example, was a Christian mystic. He was a Lutheran. He wasn't Jewish at all. But where did Marx adopt most of his program from in terms of the dialectical movement of history and so on? From Hegel, who he said he stood on his head. But this was explicitly a Christian mysticist project that Marx turned in, on, as he says, upside down, or stood on its head. He took the idealism and said it's not about idealism, it's about materialism, and it's not about transforming the ideas and letting the ideas transform society. It's about transforming society and having that change ideas. So he literally turned Hegel upside down. But that, Marx, by the way, also was a Lutheran, or at least his father was. Marx was actually an atheist. He literally decried God openly and angrily, starting like at 19 years old, very, very angry about that. And so it's a fairly superficial and ridiculous accusation that I'm doing something anti-Semitic by, say, taking Herbert Marcuse, who happened to be one of these Marxist people who's also Jewish, and reading his work out loud and, like, say, for example, repressive tolerance, and saying that this is a blueprint for totalitarianism, and then the reply is you're attacking Jews. It's sort of beyond ridiculous to insinuate this. Now, when we get to like Marcuse's,
by the way, I critique the Frankfurt School constantly, and I've never once. I will say that I am an avowed Marxist, and I cannot stand most of the Frankfurt School, and I critique them constantly, and I never get this idea. And I think also with the idea of like where you become sort of politically homeless, and it's become a bit of a cliche at the moment, but people go, oh well, you must be right wing then. But of course, like, it used to be scratch below the surface of a so-called conservative, and you just have a classical liberal, right? So you think like, oh, if you're not critical and you don't think these things through, you go, oh, I can't stand what passes for the contemporary left. I must be right wing. And you go to the right wing and you go, oh shit, no. It's like Carl Schmitt across the political spectrum.
That's right.
Where are you going to put yourself?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Carl Schmitt is actually in a rising trajectory on the right now, and it's really concerning. And for people who don't know who Carl, I'm sure a lot of your listeners do, since you just throw it out like that. But Carl Schmitt was the crown jurist of the Third Reich, and he was actually a huge opportunist. He saw the rise of the Nazis, he saw the communists moving on Germany in the 1920s, and he went to Hindenburg and he begged him to transform Germany's constitutional structure and said, let's turn this around. It will create this concept called an unbound executive, and we can hammer down, using our own iron fist, we can hammer down both of these movements and prevent Germany from going either way, Marxist or fascist. And that didn't happen. And so as soon as Hitler takes the chancellorship, like literally within weeks, Carl Schmitt jumps ship, joins ranks with the Nazis, becomes the Nazis' crown jurist, and he starts writing in particular about the so-called friend-enemy distinction, which is a very polarizing concept. And this is kind of like one of the 4 or 5 philosophers, that, if we can call them that the reactionary right turns to, while at the same time turning to look at the Frankfurt School and say, look at them, they were all Jewish. What does that tell you? Which is ridiculous, because it's more of a coincidence than anything. But when we actually look at woke, right, which is the primary target for the day, right, when we actually look at woke is actually extraordinarily Maoist, not classically Marxist whatsoever. And of course, Mao, being a bumpkin from Hunan province or wherever he was from in China, I forgot which province, but I think it's Hunan. I might be wrong. He was literally a country bumpkin that ended up, becoming very useful to the CCP, infiltrating the Kuomintang in the 20s and 30s, doing all kinds of things, eventually leading the military revolution in 49 to victory of 46 to 49. And then becoming this great guy, great figure of the Cultural Revolution, 66 through 76, when he finally dies and does the best thing he ever achieved. Mao turns out not to be a very likely candidate for Jewishness. And the whole model that we're dealing with woke, which is what we're really criticizing here, is Maoist. Marcuse read Mao. He was working for the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. He certainly would have had access to the writings of Mao at the time. He was central to a lot of the development of the American intelligence agency. So he knew what Mao was doing. The Long March through the Institutions was named after what Mao Zedong's revolution was doing, which they thought was fundamentally different than what happened in the Soviet Union. And of course, whatever Marcuse may have thought of Lenin, and I'm not entirely sure, he was not a fan of Stalin. He was certainly no fan of Stalin's. And so Stalin was no fan of Mao's. He didn't trust him. And so we see Marcuse turning and paying attention to Mao and devising a lot of his cultural transformation programs, the shift out of the working class and into the identity politics, being modeled after the way that Mao unleashed his Cultural Revolution, the shift to a youth rebellion, just like the Cultural Revolution in China depended on from the Red Guard and so on. And so the idea that this is a Jewish plot that somehow has come down through a arch Chinese country bumpkin who happened to become one of the greatest dictators in history is a bit of a stretch. And to say that anybody who criticizes this is, somehow engaging in at least thinly veiled anti-Semitism is a preposterous deflection from the belief that those ideas, Marcuse's, Adorno's, Horkheimer's in particular, but then later Kimberly Crenshaw, famously Jewish, Black woman, that these people are to be exempted from criticism, because those ideas should be exempted from criticism because authors like Horkheimer and Marcuse happen to be of Jewish family or parentage, or maybe they had some Jewish beliefs. Maybe they were into, some kind of occultism in that regard. I don't know. But occultism is occultism, regardless of whether or not it cobbles onto Christian mysticism or Jewish mysticism or Islamic or Taoist or Buddhist or whatever else. And so they're all in a totally different vein. And so I waste an inordinate amount of time rebuffing people who are just desperate for me to take this J pill, while meanwhile getting attacked like I'm somehow this raging anti-Semite. Like my day is literally getting called an anti-Semite while I tell real anti-Semites that I'm not interested in the garbage they're selling, and here's like a 2,000 word explanation for why. I spend a lot of my days every day or every week that way.
I suppose the idea is that that if by saying that the causal force behind a lot of these bad trends is Marxism, it winds up sounding like the fascists who laid the blame at the feet of communists. The first people that they hated the most were communists, right? That's the famous line in that poem, first they came for the communists. And then they kind of, as I said, mangled this around to make sense to be like a Jewish communist conspiracy where they were both rich and also trying to overthrow capitalism, all this nonsense. so I guess the idea is, and then of course what you talk about secularism, that it's not about a Jewish religion. I think part of the whole anti-Semitic Jewish conspiracy was that because they were cosmopolitans and placeless and homeless, and in that way kind of had no allegiance to anything, that was what made them suspect. So it wasn't necessarily about their religious affiliation so much, but their cosmopolitanism and also their modernism too, that they kind of, Hitler had a modernist side, obviously, but he also had a very strongly romantic side.
Oh yes,
And that
it's all romantic. That's right.
Yeah. So and he had almost, there was like Italian fascist modernism, but as soon as Nazism took power, they kind of did away with that, and it was
fascism
all like
is anti-enlightenment. This is so it's
absolutely
anti-modern thought. I'm so glad you said that. It is a romantic as opposed to a religious reaction to modernity.
Absolutely, yes. In fact, I wish I would have screenshotted this, because I remember this one when I said that radical decolonization is woke fascism. There was this woman who was coming at me calling, "You're the fascist," and her background on Twitter was literally something like, the Enlightenment was a mistake. It was like, just put 1789 is abolished, just fucking own it,
Yeah.
Anyways, so I guess, but that's kind of the idea, that if you kind of lay the blame at the feet of Marxism, then it sounds like this kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory.
Well, I understand why people think that, but I mean, I think they're making the exact same mistake Hitler made. I think it's in the 3rd chapter of Mein Kampf, where he says he argued with the Marxists and he screamed at him until his voice went hoarse. And he'd say sometimes he would lose the argument and he'd get really mad. Sometimes he'd win the argument, and then the next day they would act like they didn't even lose the argument and like nothing ever happened, and they just reassert their positions again like nothing. And it made him. I mean, it's really an interesting case study, honestly, to read how radicalized he gets trying to argue with German Marxists. And it's kind of funny. It's quaint because he's like, I'd yell at him and I'd go drink my bottle of milk and I'd come back and yell at them some more. It's like this weird thing to read. And then he has this actual paragraph where he's like, and then I realized that they're all Jews. And so then he flips, which is of course not accurate, but that's where he ends up flipping. And then his whole race occultism, which he got out of the kind of theosophical movement, which was happening in parallel, that's where he got the swastika, by the way. That he imported, as people say, he imported it from India, but he didn't import it directly from India. He imported it from India via Helena Blavatsky, who founded the Theosophical Society in 1875 in London. And these ideas kind of did this whole like early New Age wave in Europe, and the eugenics crowd really got caught up in it. And there you go. That's where Hitler sticks us in. And then Jews, for all the reasons that you said, and then also they do have one particular allegiance. They believe that they are uniquely the children of God, and their allegiance is to God and to God alone. Set them up. It's like, it's hard to convert them. It's hard to get them to, they will not denounce that in order to join some political movement, for example. They have a higher priority. This frustrates people who want them to join a particular political order, to the point where eventually people start flipping out. You add in the fact that their practices, if you are in a broadly Christian or even secular modern context, their religious practices appear quite alien. They wouldn't appear alien, say, in Jerusalem, but they do appear alien in, say, 18 some odd or 19 some odd Germany, which is heavily Lutheran and Protestant, primarily, with some Catholic influence and very little else. They do look alien in the broadly secular and overwhelmingly Christian United States. And so when you see people, kind of acting strangely, it's easy to start thinking that they have all these strangely to what you believe is kind of the cultural standard, who then are completely committed to that. And then, it's easy to start to put things together that they're somehow acting, in a conspiratorial way. Especially they often do, kind of they do help each other like a big extended religious family in many cases. And so it gets very easy to start attaching erroneous beliefs. And then, like I said, I keep coming back to this because I think it's so important. It's where that Romanticism part comes in. Because if we look at the reactions to the Enlightenment, if I might, I think that the religious reaction is clearly based on some kind of desire to go back to a more pre-modern faith. And the romantic reaction, what is it looking for? Well, it wants to react back to magic. And so when you
The
have,
enchantment, when life was enchanted, to go
that's
back to
right.
that mysticism, yeah.
Exactly. So they're looking for this kind of magic. And when you have esotericists who practice, whether it's in the Jewish tradition through Kabbalah or whatever else, or you have Christian mystics, or you have Oprah Winfrey or whatever, with their New Age stuff, when you have these characters seeking this kind of romantic drawback to enchanted magic world, but you're not familiar, say, with Orthodox Jewish practice, and some of them happen to be Jewish, and it looks like they're doing wizardry, you're like, oh, that's what Jews do, all of them, which is incorrect. Or if you see them, some of whom, some Jews are Marxists, and you see them do that, and then you say, oh, that's what Jews do. This is what they call a hasty generalization. And so the accusation is a very, very low resolution. In fact, it's low resolution, it's like pointed the wrong direction analysis of what's actually going on. I know where the criticism comes from, but it's a ridiculous deflectionary tactic that doesn't really it doesn't merit even the amount of time we've given it, frankly. But it doesn't merit taking seriously a claim that we shouldn't examine the ideas, like the idea that we wouldn't read One Dimensional Man and criticize it because something Jewish. This is preposterous.
Yeah, and also it kind of ironically feeds into that same conspiracy theory, like that there is, you don't want to do it because there is something there, and if I open Pandora's box, what will happen?
Yeah, right.
But there's this idea of that I have in my forthcoming book, not to plug it, but where I say, in the absence of political progress, movements turn mystical. And it really, that quote that you gave from Mein Kampf is exactly that, right? So he gets really frustrated at being unable to, in his terms anyway, progress the conversation, and he turns toward the sort of mysticism. This happened with socialists. So like the Owenite sect, for instance, lost the support of the working class, and they turned mystic, like a lot of the table dancing and so on. This was from a previously socialist sect. And Marx talks about this in Capital Volume 1. He says in a footnote, one might recall, but that the tables began to dance at the moment when the rest of the world seemed to stand still. So the rest of the world stands still and the tables begin to dance. Like there seems to be no political progress. And so we start to search for this kind of fulfillment of progress in imagination. We turn to imagination.
I think that's right. I think that's a very human tendency. You get frustrated. Like if you knew how, like if I said like, go to the kitchen and let's get some water or whatever, and you turn on the tap, you're not going to like do some kind of a water dance to make the water come out of the tap until the water doesn't come out of the tap. And then you're going to start like slapping it and doing all kinds of like little things.
Bargaining with God.
Yeah. Then you maybe start praying, or you start, there's all kinds of like silly things that you might do thinking that it might. And the more frustrated your attempts get, kind of the more desperate and the kind of even more whimsical or magical your approach might be. And maybe the faucet's not the best example, but I don't think it's hard to imagine. I mean, a lot of people would call it plumber, but it's not hard to imagine this idea that, you're going to start. I mean, think about the faucet's not nearly as good an example as is your laptop. When your laptop doesn't work, you might shake it, you might blow on it, you might do all kinds of things that have nothing to do with making it work. You might talk to it nicely. You might ask the universe to make it restart and work correctly. You do, all kinds. So I think that this is a general principle. I think that's a fair observation, that when you have this frustrated ambition to progress, that's where the desire to get magic involved and kind of almost retreat to a childish understanding where things do kind of happen magically for you because somebody else is doing them.
I mean, it can turn magical, but I think it also can turn scientistic, where if we have like a strong kind of belief in science and in progress in society, then that can be a deterrent from turning too mystical. But then you imbue science with a kind of mystical character, so science becomes quasi-religious. And I find, the example that you gave from Mein Kampf is very reminiscent of a proto-fascist, Vilfredo Pareto, who anybody who's listened to me talk knows that I'm obsessed with Vilfredo Pareto. I think everybody should read fascist texts and read proto-fascist texts. if only to kind of stop yourself from accidentally repeating some fucking stupid thing, like because you reject, you think, oh, modern society, it's so bad for me, it's so bad for my soul, and then you start saying all this dumb stuff about just rejecting the present and wanting to go back, right? You think, well, where we're going is somewhere real bad, so surely we have to go back, right? You just reject the present, and then you wind up saying reactionary things. Anyway, so I really like Wilfredo Pareto for this. I hate him, but I mean, I like it for being such a good example. Where he had this exact same narrative where he was trying to reason with socialists and they just would not respond to him. And he just couldn't convince them. And so this becomes, he becomes like a frustrated liberal. And I think a lot of people don't realize that the roots of fascism can be in this frustrated liberalism. And Pareto takes this turn where he leaves liberalism behind and gives up on the idea of democracy as just this illusion. And he throws himself into so-called sociology, and he becomes like a sociologist. But what he means by sociology is something like psychology. And it's this whole story about how human beings truly are not rational, and that everything that we do is simply a justification and a derivation and all these sorts of things that happens post facto. And then, famously, people, unless you were like literally strung up during World War II, people will say, oh, but were they really fascist? I mean, he died before there was a chance to really be a fascist, but he famously wrote a supportive letter to Mussolini. It's saying like, well, you have the strength to kind of crush these people where other people were pussyfooting around it, obviously paraphrasing. But I think what's interesting about this is that the legacy that we have taken from fascism, ironically, is exactly that. This has traveled onto the so-called left, that democracy is an illusion, that, they, instead of like seeing the working class as being the hope for the future, they started to see, just by virtue of like being consigned to the realm of economics and like solving problems as a matter of course in your existence, which is what Marx was talking about. They kind of started to lay the blame on the working class, and they started to say Nazism happened because the working class was led astray by demagogues and sparkly things and big events and so on, which was exactly what the fucking fascists said about socialism. Round 3. Who was it that argued democracy is beautiful in theory? In practice, it is a fallacy. Don't you even, that's a fascist! If you said fascist, you would be right. That is the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. You can read actual fascists, and they were saying, you think that you're being democratic, you think you're thinking for yourself, but really you're just being led astray by a demagogue. And now you hear leftists saying that all the time.
All the time.
What a sad irony. What a sad irony. But that's the legacy.
I mean, this has been the trajectory. I think that a lot of this, as far as the left now goes, has to get laid at the feet of the father of the so-called new left, who is Marcuse, who said many of these things himself. He's, writing, and whether it's, Essay on Liberation or One Dimensional Man, he's writing, well, advanced capitalism actually works. It allows people to build a better life. It delivers the goods. These are the things: more gadgets, more plastic, more this, more that. But they don't realize it's unsustainable, and they're not going to get what they actually want. They don't have a true, better vision. So guess what? The working class, he doesn't go quite so far as to throw them all the way under the bus. He's not quite that bold, but he says something along the lines of that, the working class in itself is still the basis for the transformation of society, but the working class for itself no longer is. It's abandoned. It has become conservative and counter-revolutionary. And then he just bashes them and says, well, we've got to figure out where that energy really lies. And he says, guess what? It lies in